In 1781, the British troops were defeated at Yorktown, and the end to the American War for Independence followed soon after. King George III reacted with devastation, writing in his private papers, "America is lost." He drafted a letter of abdication, feeling the loss of the American colonies as a failure of his government. His letter of abdication was never sent, and the king went on to establish a strong relationship with the new American ambassadors. So what led to Britain's loss of the Americas, and what role did King George III really play? Behind me is Kew Palace, on the outskirts of London, the private home of George III, Queen Charlotte and their children. George III became king in 1760, receiving the news here at Kew. He inherited a rapidly expanding British Empire. Unlike George I and George II, George III was the first Hanoverian monarch to be born and raised in Britain and to speak English as his first language. He saw himself as a patriotic British king, committed to defending Britain's empire. He would reign for almost 60 years, making him the longest reigning male monarch in British history. His reign was marked by scientific progress and discovery, but also political and social upheaval and war. War in America, revolution in France, and eventually the Napoleonic Wars, which spread across the whole of Europe. George was devoted to his family and his country. He took his responsibilities as king very seriously and strived to be a good monarch and a good man. During the 7 Years' War, Britain fought against France in North America, resulting in Britain's victory and France ceding much of its North American territory. The Native American nations had formed pivotal alliances during the war, but the end of the war was disastrous for them. The Treaty of Paris was drawn up by the European leaders and transferred control of Native American lands to the colonists without Native Americans being consulted. In 1763, a coalition of Native American nations fought back. The resistance fighters attacked the British forts and settlements, killing thousands in what became known as Pontiac's War. The rebellion was suppressed, and in reaction, the British issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The Royal Proclamation established land agreements with the Native Americans and aimed to prevent further colonial expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains. This was greatly resented by the colonists, who saw it as their right to claim the land and expand their territories. And in reality, the British government had little willpower or the resources to enforce it. The 7 Years' War had also left Britain deeply in debt. Britain now controlled 13 colonies along the east coast of North America, but maintaining and defending this volatile empire was expensive. Parliament now faced a difficult question. Who should pay for the defence and administration of this newly expanded empire? The British government decided to raise taxes to pay for the war and continue the defence of its empire. The taxes were greatly unpopular in Britain, and there was unrest across the country. It was also decided that the American colonies should help cover the costs of the war and their defence. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which was a tax on all printed materials. Large protests and boycotts sparked across the country. Colonial assemblies sent a petition to Britain. They didn't vote for Parliament, so why should it tax them? They came together under the rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, but the Townshend Acts were introduced soon afterwards. Duties were placed on numerous imported goods, such as paper, paints, lead, glass and tea. The colonists began to send letters directly to George III, petitioning him to intervene personally. So both the British people and the American colonists appealed directly to the king. But how much could George really do? In reality, George III had limited control over legislation. He could appoint his ministers, he could form governments, but decision-making was made in Parliament by his ministers. The king governed alongside them, and he was ultimately responsible to the House of Commons. But even if George did have the power to repeal all of these taxes, the king was not on the side of the colonists. He remained one of the loudest voices for resisting any rebellion. King George saw the colonists as his loyal subjects who were rebelling. He acknowledged that there was room to negotiate, but he believed that Parliament needed to have the right to legislate in the colonies. And one of the biggest fears was always that a colonial rebellion could inspire the other territories. It would set a dangerous precedent if one colony gained independence. This could trigger problems in critical territories such as India, Ireland, and the Caribbean islands. So if it wasn't George, who was it in government that was making these decisions? The mid-1700s had been a really turbulent time for British politics. George had cycled through a number of prime ministers over a relatively short span of time during the years leading up to the American Revolution. In 1770, George appointed Lord North, and he would go on to serve as Prime Minister for the entirety of the war. George III trusted Lord North and took a step back. North was committed to suppressing the rebellion. But the Prime Minister and Parliament were not unanimous in their approach to these troubles. There were politicians such as Isaac Barr, Edmund Burke, and John Wilkes, who all favoured negotiation and peace. In 1768, a new office had been created to focus on American issues: Secretary of State for the Colonies. Lord Hillsborough was its first appointee. Another hardliner. He refused to make concessions to the colonies. George III observed that he did not know a man of less judgment than Lord Hillsborough. The British public felt that the government and the king's handling of the American question was a mess. In this cartoon from 1775, we can see George III and some of his ministers. King George III's chase, driven by Lord Mansfield, is moments from plunging into an abyss. America burns in the distance. The print is a biting criticism of the king's mismanagement of his ministers. He is shown riding roughshod over the national interests of the country.
Wills Hill, the Earl of Hillsborough, an Anglo-Irish aristocrat who lived here at Hillsborough Castle, was the first Secretary of State to the colonies. He held the position from 1768 until 1772. Wills Hill was a strong backer of parliamentary authority on the colonial area. Unfortunately, some of the decisions that Wills Hill was involved in would have disastrous consequences further down the line. In the early 1770s, Boston was a growing city, a growing population with significant numbers of export and trade taking place. As a result of this was the central place where unpopular taxes were beginning to be implemented on the colonies. Wills Hill suspected that there was treason taking place and instructed the governor of Massachusetts to collate evidence with regard to this. No evidence was found of treason, but Wills Hill still sent 2 regiments from Ireland to Boston to reinstall the British presence in the city. On the 5th of March 1770, riots broke out. 5 Americans were killed as a result of this, and the British stepped back into their forts and retreated. However, it's John Adams that said that the cornerstone of independence was set on the 5th of March 1770 as a result of what is known now as the Boston Massacre. The Americans began to commemorate annually the Boston Massacre, using it as a way to increase public sentiment against the British rule. Hey Claire, how are you?
Hello, good, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, I'm well. So at Hillsborough Castle we have a number of objects in relation to Lord Hillsborough and his role within the discussions around America and the colonies at the time.
Yes, that's right, David. We have some incredible objects on display here in the Franklin dining room, all in relation to celebrating America 250 this year.
Tell me a little bit more, however, about Benjamin Franklin and his role within this.
So Benjamin Franklin was first and foremost a politician. He was based in London in the 1750s and he was there to represent colonial affairs to the British government. As such, he had quite a close relationship with Wills Hill. It wasn't exactly a good one, however. Franklin was openly hostile towards Wills Hill, especially his actions towards the colonies and the Townshend duties. And he wrote many essays explaining this, and they were published in London newspapers at the time. We have a letter here on display in which Benjamin Franklin recounts a particularly hostile encounter between the two men. It's written in 1771. However, we also have on display their changing relationship and his visit to Hillsborough Castle here in 1772. So two men met in Dublin, and Wills Hill invited Franklin up to Hillsborough Castle here. Franklin was very shocked by this, but he took him up on the offer, and the two men met here and discussed many affairs and actually found that Wills Hill was very sympathetic to American plights and wanted Ireland to receive the same benefits as well. But then after this, once the two men returned to London, it all changed back to what it was, and the relationship soured, and we all know where that went.
Absolutely. So we know that Franklin wanted to have Lord Hillsborough impeached, and Lord Hillsborough wanted to have Franklin arrested. So in terms of Lord Hillsborough, where does he move on to from here?
Unfortunately, Lord Hillsborough resigns not long after this, in August 1772. He partly blamed Franklin for his resignation. Following increasing criticisms of his actions towards the colonies, he had no choice but to leave government. Franklin, for his part, took credit for Hillsborough's resignation and wrote to his son that we have got rid of Hillsborough.
Oh, that's fantastic. And we know that Franklin, of course, went back to America and was one of the founding fathers, one of the signatories on the Declaration of Independence in 1776.
Yes, no, he had a much better career.
Absolutely. Meanwhile, in the British Parliament, attitudes towards the Acts were beginning to change. Ironically, on the same day as the Boston Massacre, the 5th of March 1770, Lord North began to put into position an effort to repeal some of the Acts. However, news of the massacre would not reach British Parliament for some time. As a partial repeal of the Acts, there was duties removed from objects. However, the British Parliament still wanted to keep a stronghold on the colonies and therefore kept a tax on tea. All tea in the colonies had to be purchased from the East India Company. In 1773, as an act of rebellion towards this, colonialists dressed up as Native Americans and stormed into the harbour at Boston and began throwing crates of tea into the harbour. At this point, in Great Britain, there was still a lack of understanding from the King, from Parliament and from the public in relation to the growing anti-British sentiment that was increasing in the colonies at this time. As a response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament introduced further acts. Boston's port was closed. In Great Britain, they were known as the Coercive Acts. However, the Americans referred to it as the Intolerable Acts. And it's quite clear at this stage that the two countries were moving closer and closer to all-out war. Even after fighting began in 1775 with the Battle of Lexington and the Battle of Concord, many American colonial leaders still were hoping to avoid all-out war. They sent one final petition to the King, known as the Olive Branch Petition, where they would declare loyalty to the King if he stepped into Parliament and stopped the decisions that they were taking. However, the King refused to accept this and issued the Proclamation of Rebellion, declaring that the colonies were in open rebellion to the Crown and that anybody associated to this would be deemed as traitors. The conflict had now turned into a full-blown war. Benjamin Franklin was now back in Philadelphia, working with his colleagues to push towards American independence. On July 4th, 1776, Franklin was one of the founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence. We're very fortunate here at Hillsborough Castle to have one of the earliest publications, published roughly about 10 days afterwards, in New York by Hugh Gain, an emigrant from Ireland. What's even more interesting is that this particular publication was one of the first to arrive in Great Britain The purpose of this Declaration of Independence and this publication was to disseminate to the colonies that America and its citizens had declared independence from Great Britain. This is one of the few publications left from July 1776 that exist across the globe. Within this document, we can see that the Americans reference directly to George III. In fact, it quotes, "A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people." For many Americans, King George III was seen as a symbol of oppression. In July 76, some of the citizens of New York City, where this declaration was printed, pulled down a statue of him. They melted it down and used it to make bullets to be returned upon the British armies. Many people consider the signing of the Declaration of Independence as the founding of the United States of America. However, the war raged on for several years after that. The Americans, with the support of the French, were able to defeat the British in 1781 against Lord Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown, a humiliating defeat for Lord Cornwallis and the British armies. This defeat ultimately led to the end of hostilities. By the end of 1782, each side had consolidated their positions. Peace negotiations then followed. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, which effectively recognised the United States of America as an independent country from Great Britain. The meeting between Lord Hillsborough and Benjamin Franklin at Hillsborough Castle has several layers of significance. It has laid the foundation stone for Hillsborough Castle to be a place for great hospitality, for dialogue, and for peace negotiations. One of the most famous being in 1998. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement was discussed here within these walls between the Irish and the British. The Americans were the mediators within this, drawing the discussions together and helping two countries come together to bring peace to Northern Ireland. Hillsborough Castle has continued the tradition of hospitality, has continued the tradition of being the backstage diplomat where worlds and minds can meet. Ultimately, in 1771, the meeting between Lord Hillsborough and Benjamin Franklin, it was days of conversations, but ultimately has led to centuries of consequence.
The American Revolution was a violent and destructive war. People died on all sides of the conflict. Native Americans were displaced in their thousands. For a long time, the view of King George as a mad tyrant persisted, fueled by the strong words written down in the Declaration. George was a figurehead that was easy to blame, but his actions at home were often far from tyrannical. In 1786, after an assassination attempt on George's life, the king expressed empathy with his attacker, remarking, "The poor creature is mad. Do not hurt her. She has not hurt me." In fact, George's major mental decline came more than a decade after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, beginning in 1788. The American Revolution was certainly one of the many pressure points that led towards George's personal crisis. When the American diplomat John Adams arrived in London after the war in 1785, the king greeted him graciously. The king told him, "I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I have always said that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power."